"Get down and stay down," Mountain Man growled at his sobbing fat wife, his real intent. "Get down and stay down." The command ripped through the smoke like thunder. Prudence Prue, Ashford froze, her heart hammering as Captain Zachariah Stormcrow, the grim mountain man everyone called the Bomb Whisperer, grabbed her by the arm and pulled her behind a stone wall just before the ground shook. A blinding flash erupted, followed by the roar of an explosion that turned night into fire. When the dust settled, the mining ridge of Thunder Hollow was gone, but the town was still standing. He had saved them all, and Prue, trembling in her soot-streaked dress, realized she had just watched a man wrestle death itself and win. The next morning, the town gathered in what was left of the square. The mayor's voice trembled as he said, "Captain Stormcrow, you saved every soul in Thunder Hollow. We have nothing to repay you with, except what you asked for." Zach's steel-gray eyes turned toward Prue. "I don't want her hurt again," he said simply. "I'll take responsibility for her life." The crowd whispered. Some pitied her, others cheered. Her father wept with relief, not noticing the way her hand shook as Zach placed his weathered palm on her shoulder. By dusk, the papers were signed. She was no longer Miss Ashford. She was Mrs. Stormcrow, wife of the man who spoke to explosions like they were old friends. That night, as he led her into a cabin built into the mountain, she smelled the metallic tang of gunpowder, saw the crates marked dynamite, and heard the low hum of detonators. And when he turned to her and said, in that deep voice that could command an army, "Get down and stay down, Prue," she thought her heart might stop. But she had no idea. His order would one day save her life again. Thunder Ridge was not a place for the faint of heart. It was carved by storms, shaped by fire, and home to men who had learned to survive both. Captain Zachariah Stormcrow fit this land perfectly, disciplined, scarred, and deliberate like a mountain that had decided to walk among men. His cabin stood at the edge of the ridge, part workshop, part fortress. The front room was a world of metal and precision, blueprints pinned to the walls, shelves stacked with blasting caps, wires, and fuses. Every item had its place, every sound had meaning, and now that world was shared with a woman who flinched at every spark. Prue tried to adjust. The townsfolk called her lucky. "The hero's wife," they said, as if being given to a man like Zach was an honor. But she didn't feel lucky. She felt small, out of place, and terrified of the man whose steady silence could fill an entire room. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even unkind. He was exact. Every movement, every word was deliberate, measured like the tick of a fuse before a blast. On their first night, she barely slept. Each time the wind brushed the shutters, she thought it was the start of another explosion. At dawn, she found Zach already awake, checking detonators at his workbench, his broad shoulders outlined by the cold gray light. "Do you always rise before the sun?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "The sun doesn't wait for me, Mrs. Stormcrow." Something in his tone, dry, almost teasing, made her pause. She wasn't sure if he was mocking her or simply stating fact. He finally turned, his gray eyes softer now. "You can call me Zach," he said, "at least when I'm not shouting orders." She tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "And I should call you Captain when you are?" He almost smiled back. "Almost. That would be wise." For days she watched him work, disarming old mines, mapping underground tunnels, teaching young miners how to tell safe ground from death traps. He spoke of pressure, timing, and patience like a preacher quoting scripture. One afternoon, as she carried water from the well, she heard a low rumble from inside his workshop. Panic shot through her. She dropped the bucket and ran, bursting through the door. "Zach!" He turned, startled, holding two metal plates. "It's just a sound test, Prue. Controlled." Her chest heaved. It sounded like, "I know." His voice softened. "That's why I'm going to help you change what that sound means." She blinked, confused. "Change it?" He nodded. "Fear is a fuse. We can cut it before it burns you alive." That night, when he brought her dinner, beans, bread, and silence, she realized something. He wasn't trying to command her. He was trying to train her, the same way he trained his men, not to obey, but to survive. And though she still trembled each time thunder rolled through the mountains, she began to notice something else in Zach's eyes when he watched her. Not pity, not duty, something steadier. Respect. The first lesson began 3 mornings later, just as dawn's light crept over Thunder Ridge. The sky was pale and cold, the world hushed except for the low hum of wind through the pines. Zach stood in the clearing behind the cabin, a small wooden crate at his feet. Inside it were a handful of blasting caps, a few harmless dummy charges, and a steel hammer. He looked every bit the soldier he once was. Steady stance, sleeves rolled, eyes unreadable. Prue hesitated at the door, arms wrapped around herself. What are we doing?" "Learning," Zach said simply. "You can't heal by hiding from what broke you." He knelt beside the crate, picked up one of the dummy caps, and held it out for her to see. "This can't hurt you. It just clicks. No powder, no fire, but your mind doesn't know that yet. We're going to teach it." Prue swallowed hard. Even the sight of the metal cylinder made her chest tighten. "And if I can't?" He met her gaze. "Then we try again tomorrow, and the next day, until the sound stops owning you." His calm was infuriating and comforting. When the first click came, she flinched so hard she nearly dropped the water flask in her hand. Her breath came ragged, her vision blurred, but Zach's voice was there, grounding her. "Breathe, in, out, look at me." She forced her gaze upward. He wasn't angry. He wasn't mocking her. He was watching, studying her, protecting her. "Good," he said quietly. "Again." They repeated it until the sun was high, until her palms stopped sweating and her shoulders stopped shaking. By noon, she could stand still through the sound. When she looked up, Zach was smiling, a rare, brief thing that felt like sunlight after weeks of shadow. "That's what strength looks like," he said. She shook her head. "No, that's just exhaustion." "Same thing sometimes." He handed her a canteen and turned back toward the cabin. "Tomorrow, we'll add the flash." She wanted to protest, to tell him she wasn't ready, but the truth was, a small spark of pride had begun to burn in her chest. For the first time since the accident, she had faced the sound and not broken. That night, she sat by the fire while Zach repaired a detonator. His hands moved with surgeon's precision, his brow furrowed in concentration. Watching him, she realized something. The man who handled death for a living did so with the gentleness of a craftsman. "Why do you still do it?" she asked softly. "The explosives, the danger. Haven't you seen enough destruction?" He paused, the lamplight catching the scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone. "Because if I don't," he said quietly, "someone else will, and they won't be as careful." Prue looked at him for a long time. For the first time, she saw past the soldier, saw the man who had chosen isolation not out of pride, but guilt. A man who believed saving lives was the only way to make peace with the ones he couldn't. Days turned into weeks. Each morning, Zack took her a little further, from clicks to flashes, from flashes to controlled blasts. Every lesson began with the same command: get down and stay down. Every lesson ended with her standing again. Eventually, the day came when a real explosion shook the ridge, one of Zack's controlled demolitions. The shock wave hit like thunder, the earth trembled beneath her feet, and instinct screamed at her to hide. Instead, she stood tall, chest heaving, eyes locked on the rising column of smoke. When Zack turned to look at her, she was smiling through tears. "I didn't fall this time," she whispered. He nodded once, pride flickering across his face. "No, you didn't." For the first time since the day the mine exploded, Prudence Ashford felt alive, not just surviving, but living. And as the echoes faded through the mountains, she realized that every blast now carried a new meaning. It no longer reminded her of what she'd lost. It reminded her of who was still standing beside her. Spring crept slowly over Thunder Ridge, melting the snow and softening the world that had long been hard and gray. For the first time since the explosion, Prue could step outside without flinching at every sound. The air smelled of pine sap and damp soil instead of gunpowder, and the cabin no longer felt like a bunker. It felt like a home. Each morning began the same way: Zack at the workbench, Prue at the stove. The quiet between them was no longer tense. It was gentle, familiar, like two rhythms finding harmony. He never spoke much, but he didn't have to. The scrape of his boots, the low hum of his whistle, the soft clink of metal tools, all of it told her she wasn't alone. One morning, while she kneaded dough, Zack appeared behind her, wiping soot from his hands. "You're using too much flour," he said simply. She turned, brow arched. "And what would a soldier know about bread?" He shrugged, a small grin tugging at his lips. "I've burned enough rations to know what not to do." Prue couldn't help it. She laughed. It was the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in months. The sound startled both of them. He froze for a moment, then said softly, "You should do that more often." She looked down, cheeks warming. "Laugh? Breathe," he said, "like that." There were still nights when the memories came, the roar of the explosion, the screams, the taste of dust and fear. When that happened, Zack didn't speak. He simply lit the lamp, pulled a chair beside her bed, and stayed until her breathing slowed. Sometimes he would hand her his pocket watch, its slow ticking grounding her to the present. "Hear that?" he would say. "That's the sound of time still moving, and so are you." Gradually, she began to find her own rhythm. She helped organize his blueprints, labeled his equipment, and began sketching her own designs for safer detonators. Zack would glance over her shoulder occasionally, offering a nod or a quiet word of approval. One evening, she hesitated before showing him a drawing. "It's just an idea," she said. "A fuse delay. It could give miners a few extra seconds to reach cover." He studied it for a long time, then looked up, his expression unreadable. "You just saved lives on paper." Her throat tightened. "You think it could work?" "I know it will," he said simply. "We'll build it tomorrow." And they did. Together, they spent days refining her design, adjusting wires, testing sparks. When it finally worked, Zack didn't smile. He laughed, a rough, rusty sound that filled the whole cabin. "You've got the makings of an engineer, Mrs. Storm Crow." She met his gaze, her own smile trembling. "And you, Captain, have the makings of a decent teacher." Their hands brushed as they cleaned the tools. Neither pulled away. By summer, they moved in quiet synchronicity. Two people shaped by fire, slowly learning warmth. When thunder rolled through the mountains one afternoon, Prue no longer flinched. She walked to the window and said, "That one's far east, probably over the ridge." Zack looked up from his bench. "How can you tell?" She smiled. "You taught me to listen." He didn't answer, but the pride in his eyes said everything. That night, as they ate supper by lantern light, Prue looked across the table and asked, "Why did you really take me in? The town would have given you anything, money, land, even a medal." He set his fork down, considering. "Because none of that needed saving." Her breath caught. "You did," he added quietly, "and I guess maybe so did I." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the mountains were a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. For the first time, Prue didn't feel trapped between the walls of that cabin. She felt safe, anchored. Later, when she drifted to sleep, she heard Zack moving about the room, checking locks, covering embers. Then came the sound of his boots pausing by her bed. She didn't open her eyes, but she heard his whisper, barely audible. "Get down and stay down. That's how I kept you alive once. But someday, Prue, I'll teach you to stand taller than the blast." Peace never lasts long on Thunder Ridge. It began with a letter, creased, stained with travel dust, and marked with the seal of the United States Corps of Engineers. Zack read it in silence at breakfast, his eyes narrowing with each line. When he finished, he folded it once, twice, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "What is it?" Prue asked, setting down her coffee. "Nothing you need to worry about." But Zack's hands were trembling, just barely, but enough for her to notice. He left before noon, saying he had to check a mine shaft near the southern slope. He didn't return until the moon had risen, his clothes covered in ash and his jaw locked tight. Prue had been waiting by the window, the lamp flickering beside her. "Where were you?" "Working," he said curtly, removing his gloves. "On what?" He hesitated a second too long. Her heart sank. "You're hiding something." "Prue, don't," she interrupted, her voice shaking. "After everything we've built, after everything you taught me about honesty and fear, you don't get to shut me out." Zack's shoulders stiffened. He turned to face her, eyes hard as steel. "The letter was from Washington. They want me to consult on a new explosives project, a mining system for rail tunnels. But it's not mining, it's weapons. They're lying about it." Her stomach twisted. "And you said yes?" "I said nothing. But you went." He exhaled, the sound weary, broken. "If I refuse, they'll send someone reckless. Someone who doesn't care who dies if it goes wrong. I thought if I took the job, I could make sure no one got hurt." She stared at him, tears forming. "You can't save everyone, Zack. Not by carrying every blast on your own shoulders." He looked away. "That's what soldiers do. And that's what kills them," she whispered. For days, they barely spoke. The silence was colder than any storm. Prue buried herself in her sketches, but even her designs trembled with anger. When Zack worked in the yard, she could hear the dull thud of his hammer striking harder than necessary, as if punishing himself. Then, one afternoon, while cleaning his desk, she found the letter. Beneath it, Another, unsigned, written in a jagged hand. You think you can hide behind the mountain, Stormcrow? We know where you live. We know who she is. The ink had smeared where Zack's thumb must have pressed too hard. Her blood ran cold. They're threatening you and me. When he returned that evening, she was waiting at the door. How long were you going to keep this from me? She demanded, holding up the note. Zack froze. Prue, no. Tell me the truth. Are we in danger? He hesitated, then finally said the words she feared most. Yes. He explained in a low voice that the organization behind the project, the same group that caused the Thunder Hollow explosion, was still active. They wanted him back, wanted his knowledge, and if he refused, they'd destroy what he cared about most. Me? She whispered. Zack's expression twisted. They think using you will break me. They don't understand. They're right. The admission hit her harder than the threat. For a moment, she saw past the captain, past the soldier, saw the man terrified of losing the only thing that made him human again. What are you going to do? She asked. His jaw tightened. End it. For good. No, she said firmly, stepping closer. We'll end it. Together. He shook his head. It's too dangerous. You said fear is a fuse. Well, I'm done letting it burn. For the first time, Zack couldn't argue. Her eyes, once filled with terror, now burned with purpose. Outside, thunder rolled across the ridge, but this time, Prue didn't flinch. She reached for his hand and said quietly, Tell me where we start. Zack stared at her for a long moment before nodding once. We start by lighting the right fuse. The storm outside built to a distant rumble, echoing through the valley like the drumbeat of war. Only this time, she wasn't the one being protected. She was the one standing beside him. The storm hit Thunder Ridge the same night the men came. Lightning carved the sky in flashes of white, and the cabin shook under the wind's fury. Prue was at the workbench loading detonator caps into a case Zack had modified earlier that day, not for mining, but for defense. She worked quickly, her hand steady despite the tremors of thunder outside. They'll come from the east, Zack said, checking his rifle and setting extra rounds on the table. The trail's narrow. If they brought explosives, we'll have about 30 seconds to respond. Prue glanced up from the detonator. And what's the plan after that? He looked at her, really looked, as if memorizing her face. You survive. She shook her head, voice firm. We survive. The first explosion ripped through the tree line, a flash of red, then smoke. Zack pulled her behind the reinforced wall. Shouts echoed through the night, followed by the crack of gunfire. The men weren't miners or engineers. They were mercenaries, armed, trained, and ruthless. Get down and stay down, Zack barked, instinct taking over as he shielded her body with his own. But this time, Prue didn't obey. She crawled toward the fuse box, heart pounding, and began wiring the line Zack had set up days ago. A defensive perimeter charge that would send a controlled explosion outward, enough to disorient the attackers without collapsing the cabin. Prue, he shouted, don't! I know what I'm doing, she yelled back. She twisted the last wire and hit the trigger. The mountain roared. Fire and dirt exploded into the sky, throwing silhouettes of men backward into the storm. The thunder of the blast echoed through the valley, powerful, perfect, clean. When the smoke cleared, Zack found her crouched behind the table, eyes wide but steady. She was trembling, but not from fear. You disobeyed an order, he said, breathless. She smiled weakly. You taught me to stand taller than the blast." He laughed then, the first full, unguarded laugh she had ever heard from him. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. When dawn broke, the cabin was battered but standing. The mercenaries were gone. Those who survived the blast had fled into the woods. The threat, for now, was over. Zack knelt by the crater outside and stared at the smoke curling up from the scorched ground. "Perfect detonation," he murmured, timed to the millisecond. Prue stood beside him, her hair tangled by wind and ash. "Maybe I had a good teacher," she said softly. He turned toward her, voice low and raw. "No, you had the heart for it long before I came along." For a long moment they stood there, watching the sunrise burn away the storm. The light fell across their faces, two souls forged in fire, scarred but whole. "Get down and stay down," he whispered again, smiling faintly. "That used to mean survive, but now it means stay with me." Prue's eyes shimmered. "Always." The mountain was silent again. Only the echo of their laughter remained, softer than the wind, stronger than any explosion. Summer rolled quietly over Thunder Ridge. The wildflowers came back first, pushing through the black soil the explosions had scarred. Then came the birds, the sound of the creek thawing, and the faint rhythm of life that refused to die. The cabin still bore its battle marks, a few bullet holes in the shutters, a cracked beam above the porch. But to Prue, they were proof of survival. Every morning she stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and found Zack already awake, repairing, mending, humming low under his breath. "Could have been worse," he said one dawn, tightening the last bolt on a new blast shield. Prue smiled, handing him his coffee. "Could have been better, too." He glanced at her, eyes soft beneath the brim of his hat. "It is better. You're still here." The wind swept across the ridge, carrying the smell of rain and powder. She looked out toward the horizon where the valley began, sunlight spilling over the peaks like liquid gold. For the first time in years, the sound of thunder didn't make her flinch. It only made her remember. "Do you ever think it'll end?" she asked quietly. "The danger, the noise, the world trying to take everything from us?" Zack set his mug down, took her hand, and pressed it against his chest. "No," he said, "but we've learned how to stand through the blast." They sat together in silence as the sun climbed higher. Behind them, the cabin glowed in the morning light, walls scorched, yet still strong, like the 2 souls inside it. And as the first distant rumble echoed through the mountains, Zack smiled faintly and whispered, "Get down, stay down, or maybe this time, just hold on." Prue leaned into him, whispering back, "Always." The storm rolled on, but so did they. Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that stories like this aren't just about love. They're about survival, about standing up after the world has tried to bury you. Prue and Zack's story isn't just fiction. It's a reminder that even in the loudest storms, someone out there is still willing to stand beside you and say, "You're safe here." Where are you listening from tonight? Let me know down in the comments. Your words mean more than you know. And if you still believe love can rise from the ashes, don't go anywhere. The next story is already waiting for you.